Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hi dear listeners, this is Raja Simhan. Welcome to the State of the Economy podcast. In this episode, we are going to discuss jobs in the logistics sector, which is poised for rapid growth in the coming years. The reason for the growth includes the government's production-linked incentive scheme and surging rural demand. Staffing company TeamLease Services says that the positive momentum in the logistics sector is expected to add nearly 10 million jobs by 2027. The transition from the unorganized to the organized sector adds to the momentum, acting as a further catalyst for the industry expansion. Let's listen to what A Balasubramanian, Vice President and Business Head, TeamLease Services, has to say on the job market in the logistics sector. Thanks, Bala, for joining. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me over.
Bala, let's start with some basics. What's happening in the logistics sector in India at this point?
To begin with, our Indian logistics industry employs anywhere between 2.5 to 3 crore people. It's not really known to be a very high-paying industry, but ironically, the cost of logistics in India is around 14% of our GDP, whereas the global average is about 8%. Now, intuitively, you would think that given the kind of population density we have, distribution should cost a lot less in India than in most other countries, but it actually costs more. So it's important for us as a nation to solve for the high cost and low efficiency of the logistics industry currently. Having said that, this sector could add anywhere in the range of about 1 crore jobs in the next 5 years or so. There are about 5 key factors driving this. I call these drags, DRAGS. D is for digitalization, R is for rural consumption, A for affordability, G for government support, and S for social media.
Okay. Is there any sector driving this growth?
Yeah, absolutely. See, when I said digitalization and rural consumption, the first 2 factors, by digitalization, I was referring to the fact that there is increased access to e-commerce among our population. And that, coupled with the increased rural consumption, makes for a very potent mix. Now, e-commerce is inseparable from logistics. India is still a relatively underpenetrated market for e-commerce. Hence, exponential growth in e-commerce augurs very well for logistics. This is obvious, though. A lot of people would be able to relate to this. In fact, the 5 factors that I mentioned, out of those, 4 would be relatable to most people. One which may not be very relatable to people is government support, because that is happening behind the scenes, but it's driving a whole lot of impact.
The latest technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, seems to be catching up in every sector. How is it in the logistics sector?
Adoption of technology and digitalization, automation, technology like AI, ML is catching on in every space, and logistics is no exception to this. While this is to an extent solving for the problem of low efficiency that I alluded to earlier, and also the low productivity, but it's also creating new jobs in areas such as data analytics, software development, automation, etc. It is not necessarily going to lead to a slightly muted increase in job creation in proportion to the increase in the sector's output. Secondly, coming to what is not very obvious in this is there really a shortage of manpower in this space? Yes and no. There is a shortage of manpower in certain pockets of the country, not so much in the others. For example, if you look at the demand for workforce in the southern states, the 5 southern states, by and large, it's extremely high, and organizations such as ourselves are faced with the prospect of having to mobilize people from the Indo-Gangetic plains.
When you say manpower, obviously the numbers which you throw is huge. What sort of skills are actually being looked at? Is it kind of basic skills or advanced, mid-level? Is it also technology-oriented, or is it across all these which is happening now?
There will be some combination of all these going forward, because while, of course, even today, bulk of the workforce that is employed in the logistics space is as per definition unskilled, that doesn't mean it's completely with zero skills, but there are basic skills involved which you can inculcate in a person within a few days. It doesn't really require extensive training or education for that matter. And this outsized demand for unskilled workforce is continued or expected to continue in the same manner for the next few years as well. But some digital literacy and some understanding of being able to read English is also expected. If that's not there, then these people are by and large unemployable. So that's already become the norm now.
Okay. But this industry is still a very unorganized industry, isn't it? How do you define whether the organized versus the unorganized, and how people towards either is it going towards the organized sector or towards the unorganized sector?
Yeah. So I think some global context here is extremely important. I mean, if you were to break down logistics and supply chain into various segments, there is warehousing, third-party logistics. You have, then within transportation, you have line haul, road transport, there is rail, there is ocean freight, and then there is parcels. Now, by and large, small parcels, ocean freight are consolidated across the world, but road transportation, which accounts for a significant chunk of logistics spend globally, remains a fragmented industry even in developed countries. So it's not very different elsewhere in the world. I think it's very important for us to put that out there. And yes, in India, it's extremely fragmented. The typical transportation company would probably employ a couple of trucks up to maybe a half a dozen trucks, right? And this accounts for the vast majority of the transportation companies out there. Yeah. So capacity building, consolidation would definitely need to happen, and it is happening. We can see it. While it is still sluggish, it's not really happening at the pace that it should. There is a growing emerging trend of organized players, and this is leading to increased investment because these are the people who do have the capital to invest in building better infra and technology. And it's also creating new jobs, and it will lead to improved productivity and hence lower cost as well.
Okay. But when you say logistics manpower per se, what's the definition here? Is it, are we referring only to the truck industry or the warehouses? Or we are also referring to maybe the aviation sector, also the ground handling workers in the airports. So where are we drawing a line on this actually?
Yeah, essentially, when you say transportation could involve transportation of people and goods. Logistics is typically just goods. Yeah. So if you refer to just logistics, air cargo would come under its purview, not necessarily air travel. Yeah. And yes, we do have to include air cargo handlers, warehouse operations, personnel, truck drivers as well. The generic profiles that we would find in warehouses such as pickers, packers, movers, loaders, unloaders, etc. And all the way down to the last mile delivery personnel who deliver parcels at your home. So it's the entire supply chain.
Okay. But how is it this logistics sector being looked at as a career opportunity? Obviously, there are challenges getting people, right?
There is definitely a lot of challenge getting people because, like I mentioned, logistics is not really known to be a very high-paying industry, which means typically the people who do get hired end up, the vast majority of people end up getting hired at minimum wages, which means there are numerous other opportunities which could actually provide them slightly more gainful employment. And the kind of people we are talking about, by and large, would shift for a few hundred rupees extra per month. And that presents a huge challenge, especially among the last mile delivery personnel. The monthly attrition could be anywhere in the range of 20 to 40%.
Oh, okay. How do you define this last mile examples could be?
The last mile delivery partners who work with restaurant aggregators, e-commerce companies, etc. So these are the people who typically are known as riders, who deliver parcels. So among this workforce, the attrition is, about 20 to 40% a month means that in 3 to 4 months, you completely churn your entire workforce.
Mm-hmm. This smaller cities seems to be doing well, isn't it? Like places like, say, Coimbatore or Indore, Jaipur, Ahmedabad. How are they getting into this larger picture? We keep hearing the bigger cities seems to be doing well in logistics sector. But what's your feel on this, Bala?
The places like Coimbatore and Ahmedabad should not be called smaller cities at all anymore. I think they have become significant centers of business and commerce long back. Uh, and they are, I mean, almost at par with the established metros. With tier 2 and tier 3 cities, which are growing on a smaller base, we are expecting to see significantly larger growth in percentage terms. While they may not be able to outweigh the demand in metros in absolute terms, but in terms of incremental growth, they are going to outstrip these metros over the next 5 years. So the demand for workforce as well is expected to move from 60-40 in metros versus tier 2, tier 3 locations to about 40-60 over the next 8-10 years.
Okay. But within the logistics, the categories which you pointed out, where do you see the maximum number of hiring happening actually?
It's mostly happening at the entry level. So we're talking about the typical profiles such as warehouse operations personnel, and like I mentioned before, your pickers, packers, movers, loaders, unloaders, etc., plus the last mile delivery personnel. Now, if you were to look at the typical ratio of warehouse operations personnel versus the last mile delivery personnel, it's usually in the ratio of about 1:2. And these two sets of people would account for anywhere between 80 to 90% of the workforce that's required in the logistics space, and the other 10 to 20% would come from slightly more skilled personnel. And this would account for management personnel as well. So including that, it's less than 20% typically.
Is it a kind of a seasonal also hiring with the festival? Normally we see demand for this last mile people whom you referred to really go up, and there is also in terms of the warehouses, and also we see. But that is for at least 4-5 months. Is it so, or is it kind of now maybe throughout the year we are seeing such pattern actually?
No, there is definitely an impact driven by festive season, and it's not just for the last mile delivery personnel. Again, we have this bias toward last mile delivery personnel because those are the people whom we interact with as consumers. But there is an increase in the workforce across the entire supply chain, which also includes the back-end operators, such as the people employed in warehouses, factories as well. In factories, of course, because of how there is a lag between production and consumption, the ramp-up would start happening a few months before festive season as well. Typically, the bump in demand for workforce during festive season or around festive season is in the range of about 10 to 20%, and this year it's around 20% more sequentially.
And what is the reason this year? Is it a season oriented? I mean, season looks good, or is it something else?
Favorable base effect as well. I think last year, if you were to look at the festive season, it came on the back of the outbreak of war and extremely high commodity prices. So the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out in Feb last year, and subsequently over the next 5-6 months, because of two factors. One is commodity prices going up, and secondly, supply chains getting choked everywhere. It was extremely difficult for various companies to manage their costs, and they had to pass on price increases to consumers. And because of this, demand was muted, especially in rural markets. Now, typically, rural markets do account for close to half of the revenue of various consumer goods companies. And because of that, the last festive season, there wasn't really much of a demand for increased workforce around festive season. But now, with inflation easing, and prices stabilizing, consumer products companies are expecting to see beyond festive season.
This logistics performance index, actually, India did phenomenally well. But how do you see the role of the industry itself in supporting India's really booming economy and its push in the global logistics landscape?
Yeah. So here is where the aspect of government initiatives comes into the picture. I mentioned that this may not be a very intuitive or relatable aspect which people would be able to see. Now, I would like to specifically focus on 3 initiatives which would actually help in making logistics as a source of strategic advantage for India as an economy rather than as a drain of resources. Because at 14% of GDP, it is a drain of resources against the global average of 8%. The first initiative is NLP, which is the National Logistics Policy. Now, the second initiative is the PM Gati Shakti scheme. And thirdly, I would also like to talk about PLI, that is the Production Linked Incentive Policy as well. If you were to look at the National Logistics Policy, that is NLP, this is a comprehensive framework that covers a wide range of issues related to the logistics sector. Now, this includes process re-engineering, multimodal transport, digitalization and digitization, infrastructure development, and even skill development. And if you were to look at the objective of the scheme, it is to reduce the cost and also to increase the efficiency and productivity of this industry as a whole. The ROI that we get as a country from this industry has to go up. And that is the problem statement that this initiative is trying to solve. The second scheme, that is the PM Gati Shakti scheme, as the name indicates, is a more focused initiative that specifically targets improving connectivity between various modes of transportation. About 100 different projects have been identified as part of this. One of them is the upcoming Noida International Airport near Jewa, UP. And the objective of this initiative is to make for a much more conducive environment for the flow of goods, which would reduce the time and hence the cost of transportation as well. Now, because of this, what's going to happen is that the logistics cost will come down, which means the cost of production and distribution will also come down, because of which, again, prices will come down, consumption will go up, which leads to even more production and distribution. And this will also help in making our exports more competitive. Here is where the PLI scheme comes into the picture. Now, the objective of the PLI scheme is to ensure that manufacturers get incentivized not just for catering to domestic demand, but also for exports, because ultimately it's about production. It's not a consumption-driven incentive. It's a production-linked incentive scheme. Now, specifically three sectors: electronics, pharmaceuticals, and automobiles. These three sectors alone so far have benefited to the extent of 1 lakh crore rupees in approved incentives from this scheme. Now, this is going to anyway lower the cost of production, which will increase domestic consumption and will also make our exports more competitive. This, in tandem with reduced logistics costs because of schemes like NLP and PM Gati Shakti scheme, is going to create a perpetual virtuous cycle for us.
I want to understand about how TeamLease is helping the logistics companies in terms of hiring. What do you do and where do you expect your hiring to come from to serve these clients actually?
So there are three things that we do. If I were to break down everything that we do in our contribution towards the logistics sector, one is identification of people. Secondly, in skill development. And thirdly, in giving them gainful placement or employment opportunities. Now, when I speak about identification, it happens through multiple modes. So we have our own TeamLease Skills University in Baroda and Gujarat, and we also have partnerships with numerous universities across the country and also with organizations like the National Skill Development Center. Apart from this, we also conduct various job fairs and also partake in job fairs across the country. And we act as a platform, essentially. We may not be a job creator, but then we are a platform that connects people to jobs. And it's also important for us to be able to contribute towards the employability of these people as well, and be able to place them in gainful opportunities where not only are they paid, but they're also well taken care of. And here is where our relationships with over 3,500 corporates in India comes into the picture. Now, these are large employers who are also compliant and ensure that these people have career paths and not just a job.
On that note, thanks Bala for joining. It was really good talking to you.
Okay, thank you so very much for having me once again.